Hi everyone, welcome back to The Lemon Abroad. Today I would like to share with you a very important video. It is about something that has impacted my family directly, and that is Lynch syndrome. Today is March 22nd. It is Lynch Syndrome Awareness Day. It is estimated that up to 1 in 300 people could have Lynch syndrome, and up to 95% of those people may not know that they have it. They might not have ever even heard of Lynch syndrome, which is why I felt it was so important to make this video and share it with you. I didn't know what Lynch syndrome was either. I had never heard of it until after my own mother was in treatment for a Lynch cancer. What I did know was that my family had a big history of developing certain kinds of cancers, and especially at a relatively younger age than you might see in the general population. So I want to talk about what Lynch syndrome is, and if any of these conditions that I'm describing sound familiar to you, I would definitely encourage you to speak to your doctor about the possibility of having genetic counseling and genetic testing. Obviously, I am not a doctor or a medical professional. The information that I'm sharing here should in no way be construed as an expert opinion. This is a very basic introduction to a condition that is very complex and multifaceted, and this is not in any way medical advice. I am just trying to spread awareness about this condition for people who may have never heard of it before, and I encourage anyone who may recognize a pattern in their own history or their own family history to seek medical advice about the possibility of having Lynch syndrome in their family. A bit about my own experience with Lynch syndrome. After my mother tested positive for Lynch syndrome, it was also necessary for me to be tested. And I do not have Lynch syndrome, but I do still feel its impact on my life, of course, because people close to me have Lynch syndrome, including my mother. So what is Lynch syndrome? Basically, it is the result of a hereditary gene mutation. It impacts one of 5 genes that we have, which are called mismatch repair genes. So what these genes do is they fix errors in our DNA that could lead to the development of certain cancers. And so if you have Lynch syndrome, it means that one of those genes is mutated. So it's not working properly to fix those errors in DNA, and therefore that person has a greater chance of developing certain cancers than the rest of the general population. And it also means that there's a higher chance that they could develop those cancers at a younger age. Lynch syndrome goes back for generations in some families, including mine. We can trace Lynch-related cancers throughout our family tree, going back generations. But you could also be the first person in your family, or at least the first person that you know of, to be diagnosed with a Lynch-related cancer and test positive for Lynch syndrome. So that's why genetic testing in people who have a Lynch-related cancer is so important. And it's also important that if you have a family history of Lynch syndrome, to speak with your doctor about the possibility of genetic counseling and genetic testing. Being diagnosed with Lynch syndrome does not mean that you will get cancer. This is what I was telling myself when I first learned about Lynch syndrome and while I was going through the testing process. I would tell myself that even if I was positive, it didn't mean that I was definitely going to get cancer. But what it would mean was that I would have access to the preventative care and screenings that I needed. I would have this knowledge that would empower me and would empower my medical team to know what to be looking out for. Because if you are diagnosed with Lynch syndrome, you will be able to have screenings for certain cancers that the rest of the general population wouldn't normally even be screened for unless they were having certain symptoms, like screening for endometrial cancer. It also means that you'll have access to more regular screenings for certain cancers than the general population would, and that you would be able to start those screenings at a younger age than the general population would. So for example, screenings for colorectal cancer, which is one of the main Lynch cancers, depending on where you live for the general population, screening may start at 45 or 50 at the youngest. And people who have a clear screening may then go 5 or 10 years before being screened again. So I know that for relatives of mine who have been diagnosed with Lynch syndrome, they will get screening for colorectal cancer as soon as they find out they have Lynch syndrome, even if that means they're in their 20s. And they'll probably continue to be screened every year for the rest of their life, no matter if their previous screening was clear or not. As I mentioned, probably the most common Lynch-related cancer is colorectal cancer. It's estimated that anywhere from 3 to 5% of colorectal cancers are the result of a Lynch mutation. Another cancer that people with Lynch syndrome are more likely to develop than the general population is endometrial cancer. And there are a wide variety of other cancers that people with Lynch syndrome may be more likely to develop than the rest of the general population. I've already mentioned colorectal cancer and endometrial cancer. There are others, including bladder cancer, ovarian cancer, skin cancer, stomach cancer, pancreatic cancer, prostate cancer, brain cancer, and there are several others. So you can see why it's very important to get tested for Lynch syndrome, so that way you can be monitored by a medical team knowledgeable about Lynch syndrome who can put you on a preventative screening plan. One thing that I do want to mention is that just because I tested negative for Lynch syndrome does not mean that I don't mention my family history of both having Lynch syndrome and having cancers in general. There are still other hereditary and environmental factors to consider. So I'm still very vigilant about my health, staying on top of doctor's appointments and preventative screenings, and always mentioning to doctors about my family history of Lynch syndrome and any other family history that is relevant. I hope that this video can help to bring some awareness to Lynch syndrome. And again, if any of this sounds familiar to you or your family history, I would definitely encourage you to speak to your doctor about genetic counseling and genetic testing. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Ciao.